They said it was too dangerous to survive. Not a weapon, not a spell, a book. A book whispered about in corridors, hidden under floorboards, burned in public squares. Why? Because its words didn't chain people, they freed them. Every page challenged the order that ruled by fear. Every margin note was a secret act of rebellion. For centuries, priests, kings, and inquisitors tried to erase it, convinced the world would unravel if ordinary people learned what it contained. But fragments endured, smuggled in memory, scribbled in code, passed hand to hand like contraband fire. So what was written inside that made the most powerful institutions tremble? What knowledge was so threatening that it had to be buried under ash and silence? This is the story of the most dangerous book the Church tried to suppress. We start in a locked archive at midnight. A thin volume sits under dust, its spine unmarked, its edges singed. The label says only, "Restricted." You lift it. The room goes quiet, as if the walls are waiting. This is the book they hid, not because it curses, not because it blasphemes, because it frees. It speaks to the part of you that woke before rules, before fear, before you learned to ask permission to be yourself. It does not fight faith, it unmasks control. It says, truth is not a cage. Truth is a door. Pages turn like breath. The voice inside is simple and steady, almost kind. It points to a power you carry but forgot to name. It asks questions, no sermon answers. It teaches in images, in short lines, in quiet courage. It does not shout, it does not threaten, it invites. Why was that a threat? Because a free soul bows from love, not pressure. Because a heart on fire is hard to herd. Because when you see for yourself, you cannot be steered with fear. That is why torches once circled books, not only people. That is why some shelves became flames. This audiobook is a guided reading of that dangerous wisdom, its story, its ideas, and the storms it sparked. We will meet the keepers who hid it, the hunters who chased it, and the readers who changed after touching it. We will test its claims, line by line, no jargon, no secret handshake. Just clear language, open eyes, and a steady pace. You decide what to keep, you decide what to leave. But first, we open the door together, one page, one breath, one brave step into light. The archive did not welcome visitors. It was not a place you wandered into with casual steps or idle curiosity. Heavy doors sealed it from the world, iron handles worn smooth by centuries of reluctant hands. The air inside was not ordinary air. It carried the silence of forgotten centuries, the hush of secrets too delicate to be spoken aloud. In the farthest corner of the room, beneath a window long ago bricked shut, rested a row of shelves marked "Restricted." Most volumes in this section bore no titles, only tags with numbers that looked more like case files than books. Dust settled thickly across their spines, as if to say, you were never meant to open these again. But one stood apart. Its leather cover was cracked and dry, the edges browned as if they had once touched flame. No label, no title, no author. Just a presence that seemed to wait. The young man, though no one would later remember his name, felt his pulse climb the moment he drew near. He had come searching for something ordinary, a reference, a citation, a text long out of print. Yet here, in the dim light, he stopped. His breath turned shallow. His hand hovered just above the cover, as though he feared the book might recoil from his touch, and then he opened it. The first page was blank. The second bore a single line, written in ink so faint it seemed etched into the paper by memory alone. No gate stands before truth, only sleep. The words sank into him like a whisper travelling through bone. He turned the page again, half expecting more emptiness, half fearing what he might find. What greeted him was not a sermon, not a curse, not a tangled list of commandments. Instead, it was a plain description, simple as a neighbour's voice. You were born with eyes that see, but you were taught to close them. This book is the opening. He shivered. Books were not supposed to speak like that. They could argue, lecture, plead, but not recognize you, not call you awake as if you had been waiting for the invitation. The silence around him deepened. He could almost hear the shelves leaning closer. He kept reading. Each sentence was short, steady, never rushing. It was as though the book knew how to speak directly to the inner ear, bypassing thought, sliding into the quiet core of awareness. It told him that truth was not fragile, but his memory of it was. It told him that power was never in chains, but in choices. It told him that no priest, no ruler, no authority could give him what he already carried within. And here the danger lay. Not in blasphemy, not in rebellion, but in clarity. The young man turned another page and found a margin note, written in a different hand. Not printed, not copied, but scrawled hurriedly, almost desperate. Read quickly. They will take it back. He froze. Someone before him had left this warning, perhaps centuries earlier, perhaps only decades. He ran his fingers over the ink, half expecting it to smear onto his skin. It was dry, but alive. Whoever had written those words had touched this very page. He was not alone, and now, for the first time, he understood why the archive was locked, why the shelves were bricked behind darkness. It was not the book's content alone, it was its effect. Whoever read it was never quite the same. They walked out with eyes open, hearts awake, and obedience broken. For power built on fear cannot endure a reader who discovers that love does not demand chains. He closed his eyes. The room pulsed with quiet weight. He imagined the countless others who might have found this book before him, monks sneaking in by candlelight, scholars risking exile, peasants learning to read only to uncover forbidden pages. How many had been caught? How many had carried its words in memory after the flames consumed the parchment? The thought sent a chill through his chest, but also a fire. If he could read these words, then so could others. If he carried them, no torch could take them away. And perhaps this was the secret of its survival. Not shelves, not ink, not leather, but living hearts, choosing to keep its flame alive. The young man leaned closer, reading aloud under his breath. The chain is fear, the key is choice, open and walk. The words settled in him like a vow, and then, faintly, he heard it. Footsteps echoing from the corridor outside. He snapped the book shut, heart racing. A heavy key turned in the lock. The guardians of silence were returning. He had minutes, maybe seconds. He slid the book back into its space, the leather whispering against its neighbours, but not before he tore a scrap from his notebook and copied the line that had gripped him most. No gate stands before truth, only sleep. He slipped the note into his pocket. The door creaked open. Torchlight filled the room. He lowered his head, feigning study of another shelf. But inside, he carried something that no guard could search, no lock could close, no fire could burn. For the dangerous book had already begun its work. The book was never meant to look new. Every copy that survived carried scars. Some bore burn marks where fire had licked but failed to consume. Others smelled of damp cellars, where mildew crept along the leather until hands braver than mould rescued them. But the most telling marks were not on the covers or the pages themselves. They lived in the margins. The margins whispered louder than the printed words. They were places where frightened readers had written hurried notes, half prayers, half confessions. Some were warnings to the next hand that would turn the page. Others were sketches of symbols, keys, suns, eyes, doors, small enough to be dismissed as doodles, yet too deliberate to be meaningless. You could see where candle wax had dripped onto the paper, forming circles of hardened amber. You could almost feel the tremor of the quill as someone scrawled their thoughts with more urgency than care for ink. One margin carried only a single word, repeated again and again until the ink tore holes through the parchment. Awake, awake, awake. Another margin contained a brief question. Who profits from my fear? Yet another, written sideways along the page edge, said, If they knew I read this, I would not see another dawn. These words, fragile but defiant, were more dangerous than the book itself. They proved it was not just theory. It had been lived. It had unsettled hearts. It had whispered into lives that refused to stay quiet. Historians often treat margins as noise, distractions, scribbles of no value. But here, in this forbidden volume, the margins were the heartbeat. They showed us what the book truly did. The text itself was calm, clear, even gentle. It invited rather than commanded. It offered doorways instead of walls. Yet the fear of punishment wrapped so tightly around the readers that their very act of responding became rebellion. To write anything at all in those blank edges was to leave evidence of disobedience. Each margin note was a crime scene. Each ink line was a confession whispered to the future. Imagine a monk in a cold stone scriptorium, hand aching from hours of copying sacred texts approved by the church. His candle burns low. His breath fogs the air. He reaches for this forbidden book, hidden under his robe, and opens it beneath the desk. His eyes race across the lines. His pulse quickens. He dares not copy full passages. That would be too dangerous. But in the narrow white space beside a sentence, he scratches 3 words. This is true. That is enough. His truth outlives him. Centuries later, another reader will see those words, feel the echo of his heartbeat, and know the same fire still smoulders. Ash itself became part of the margins. Some surviving copies carried grey smudges along the sides, marks from where pages had brushed against the soot of other burned books. These stains looked like shadows of loss, reminders of what did not escape. Scholars examining such copies would often think the dirt meaningless, yet the truth was chilling. Those ashes were the remains of silenced voices, the ghost of a destroyed library pressed into the survivors. To touch those smudges was to hold the last trace of wisdom turned to smoke. But not all margin notes were warnings or laments. Some carried hope. In one copy, now half crumbled, a hand had written beside the text, "My daughter will know this too." Imagine the courage behind that. Someone who risked everything not only to read, but to pass the truth to the next generation. Someone who understood that the true flame does not stay locked in one era, but leaps forward, carried by the brave. Perhaps that daughter read. Perhaps she lived differently because of it. Perhaps her laughter, her choices, her quiet refusals to bend, carried echoes of those margins into her world. The church understood the danger of margins. That is why inquisitors were instructed not merely to burn the books, but to examine them first, to see if they contained markings that revealed a network of readers. A margin with a secret symbol could link one town to another. A sentence underlined in the same way across different copies could betray a shared teacher. These scribbles were like threads weaving a hidden web across countries. Burn the pages, and you try to kill one idea. Burn the margins, and you attempt to erase the evidence of community. But fire cannot consume memory once it has lodged itself in living souls. The young man who first reopened the book in our story noticed these margins quickly. He found himself tracing them more than the printed lines. He saw how each note was like a voice leaning across time to whisper encouragement. He realized he was not alone. Others had walked this path, trembling yet determined. Their hands shook, their ink bled, but their defiance survived. He copied some of these notes into his own journal, knowing even that act could condemn him if discovered, yet he could not resist. These fragments felt like lifelines cast across centuries. Why do margins matter so much? Because they reveal the personal cost of truth. A text can speak in general terms, but the margin shows how it collides with a human life. This is true. They will kill me. For my daughter. Each phrase is soaked with risk. Each note is a bridge, between the printed word and lived reality. Without margins, the book is philosophy. With margins, it is testimony. It is flesh and blood. It is courage etched in ink. Even today, when we read digital texts, we highlight, we comment, we annotate. We leave trails of thought that turn static words into living dialogue. The Forbidden Book's readers did the same, only their stakes were life and death. Every smudge of ink in those white spaces testifies that someone believed the truth was worth the risk of discovery. Their ashes whisper still. We were here, we saw, we knew, and we wanted you to know too. The margins remain because courage leaves residue. Even when pages burn, even when shelves collapse, something clings to the edges, something survives. It is not loud, it is not polished, but it is stubborn. And that stubbornness was enough to carry the Forbidden Book through centuries of suppression into your hands, into your ears, into this moment. And so, the story of the book cannot be told without the story of the margins. The ashes, the whispers, the trembling notes in the white spaces, these are not decorations. They are the true testimony of what it meant to read with danger pressing at your back. They are the fingerprints of freedom smudged across history, waiting for you to notice, waiting for you to remember. Fear never comes wearing its true face. It would be too easy to spot if it did. If fear appeared as a monster, teeth bared, claws extended, most people would run, they would resist, they would see it for what it is, a thief of peace, a strangler of freedom. But fear is cunning. Fear learns to wear holy robes. It dresses in the language of duty, of tradition, of obedience. It bows and crosses itself. It raises its voice in solemn tones. And in this disguise, it convinces you that shackles are sacred. The Dangerous Book named this plainly. It did not say fear is evil. It said fear is a tool, useful for survival but deadly when disguised as truth. When fear whispers honestly, the fire is hot, the cliff is steep, the wolf is near, it serves you. But when it masks itself in holiness, your God demands your silence. Your worth is measured by compliance. Your questions are sin. Then fear ceases to protect and begins to enslave. That was the message that rattled the foundations of authority, because it tore the mask from power's favourite weapon. The young man, reading under the torchlight of that archive, found passages that stripped his world bare. One line read, "When love commands, it never threatens. When fear commands, it always does." Another said, "Fear is the echo of those who cannot rule without it." Knowing even this faint mark could betray him if someone searched his notes. But he could not leave the words untouched. They were too sharp, too clean. They sliced through the fog he had breathed since childhood. He remembered sermons that had thundered about hellfire. He remembered elders who warned him that even thoughts must be guarded lest they bring punishment. He remembered the way people bent their heads in silence, afraid not of God's love, but of God's imagined wrath, projected by men who needed obedience. He realized, with a slow ache in his chest, that much of what he had called faith had been fear dressed in ritual. It had smelled of incense and echoed in stone cathedrals, but at its root it had been trembling. The book taught him how to test the disguise. It offered a simple practice. When you encounter a command, ask yourself, does this grow love or shrink it? If it grows love, it may be true. If it shrinks love, it is fear in costume. The test was not theological. It was not abstract. It was practical, almost childlike in its simplicity. Yet this was exactly why it threatened the authorities. A test that any farmer, seamstress, or baker could apply without permission meant they no longer needed gatekeepers to interpret truth. In one of the margins, a reader long ago had scribbled, "Fear told me silence was holy, but love told me voice is holy." That note struck him like thunder. He realized that once you see the disguise, the spell breaks. Once fear is unmasked, it cannot command with the same authority. Its threats lose weight. You begin to notice how often fear had been the architect of your choices. You begin to ask what your life would look like if love had been the architect instead. The church of the time understood this danger very well. Entire systems of power rested on fear's disguise. Confession threatened damnation if honesty faltered. Attendance threatened isolation if absence occurred. Authority threatened eternal loss if loyalty wavered. Remove fear, and the structure sways. Replace fear with love, and the structure collapses. The dangerous book did not call for rebellion in the streets. It did not shout against altars or tear down cathedrals. It simply taught people how to see, and seeing is the end of false power. But unmasking fear is not without its cost. The first thing that appears when the mask falls is the hollow space it filled. Fear had structured life, given rules, drawn lines. Without it, there is silence. Without it, there is open space. Many people find that emptiness unbearable. They run back to fear's disguise because at least it feels solid. The book warned of this too. It said, "Freedom first tastes like falling. Only later does it taste like flight." The young man copied that line carefully. He felt himself on the edge of falling already. His heart was pounding with both excitement and dread. What would his life look like if he no longer obeyed fear disguised as faith? What relationships would shift? What duties would dissolve? What chains would break? He knew that such questions are not answered in an instant. They unfold slowly, sometimes painfully, as one step after another reveals a new horizon. Yet, he also knew he could not go back. Once fear's mask is torn, it can never be worn convincingly again. The book gave examples of fear's disguise in stories. One told of a farmer who believed that if he did not give a portion of his crop to the local priest, his harvest would fail. The farmer obeyed for years, living in scarcity, trembling with each drought. Then one season he withheld his offering, not out of rebellion, but because his family would have starved without it. That year, his fields yielded the richest harvest he had ever seen. His neighbours whispered of luck. He whispered of freedom. Another story told of a widow who was warned never to read sacred texts herself, lest her untrained eyes twist the truth. For decades, she listened only to the sermons fed to her. But one day, she opened a page in secret. She discovered words of kindness and mercy she had never been told. Fear had disguised itself as reverence, keeping her from what had been hers all along. She wept not from terror, but from relief. These stories were seeds, planted for readers who saw their own lives mirrored in them. They were reminders that fear always limits, while love always expands. The authorities labelled them heresy. The readers knew them as truth. Fear still wears disguises in every age. It cloaks itself in patriotism, in culture, in family expectations. It says, "You will lose respect if you step out of line. You will lose belonging if you speak your heart. You will lose everything if you dare to see differently." And still, the test remains. Does this grow love, or does it shrink it? The young man left the archive that night with trembling hands. The words on the page burned in him like coals. He walked the streets under starlight, hearing the distant bells of the cathedral, and he felt their toll differently. They no longer sounded like holy warnings. They sounded like iron masks rattling. He knew fear would try to disguise itself again, whispering in softer tones, wrapping itself in duty. But he also knew he had learned to recognize the shape of its mask. And recognition is the first freedom. What makes this book dangerous is not that it defies faith. It is that it unmasks fear. And once you see what fear really is, once you strip off its disguise, you can never be ruled by it again. That was the lesson of the 7th chapter. Fear cannot stand when love is awake. The dangerous book never told its readers to rebel with swords or to shout their defiance in public squares. It knew that noise draws fire. It knew that power listens for loudness, for cries, for chants that can be crushed with iron. What it offered instead was something quieter, more unsettling, and infinitely harder to control. It offered the practice of the silent yes. At first, the young man who read the book in the archive thought the phrase sounded strange. Was not silence the mark of submission? Was not yes the word of obedience? But as he lingered with the lines, their meaning slowly unfolded, delicate as dawn breaking behind a curtain of mist. The book explained that the most dangerous kind of yes was not the one forced by fear, but the one whispered by freedom. This yes was not shouted to an authority. It was spoken inwardly, a vow to oneself. I choose this path because love calls me, not because fear demands it. In the margin of one fragile page, an earlier reader had scribbled a trembling line. This yes cannot be taken, only given. That note struck him more deeply than the sermons he had heard his whole life. He began to realize that true obedience could not be commanded. It had to rise from within like water from a spring. When it rose freely, it refreshed everything it touched. When it was forced, it rotted the well. The silent yes was not about outward compliance, but inner alignment. A man could bow to the altar with a spine bent by fear, or he could bow with his heart awake in love. Outwardly, both gestures looked the same, but inwardly they were worlds apart. The book warned, the world measures posture, but heaven measures motive. This line, though written centuries ago, pierced him as if it were whispered directly into his ear that very night. The book gave simple examples. A baker wakes before dawn to prepare bread. If he labours from dread of hunger or punishment, his bread will fill but not nourish. If he labours from love of craft and service, the same bread carries life. A mother raises her child. If she disciplines from fear of shame or gossip, the child will grow brittle. If she disciplines from love's clarity, the child will grow steady. The action looks alike. The silent yes makes all the difference. The Church had long insisted that yes must be spoken to authority, that one must bend to the priest, to the doctrine, to the order that claimed to speak for God. But the dangerous book inverted this order. It said the true yes could only be spoken to God directly, within the temple of the heart. Any other yes was borrowed, fragile, and false. This teaching was poison to institutions built on obedience. Because if every man and woman could decide whether their yes came from love or fear, no power could guarantee their control. The young man thought of his own life. How many times had he said yes with his lips while his soul whispered no? How many rituals had he performed out of fear of being judged? How many times had he bowed, not because he believed, but because he dreaded the eyes of others? He felt a burn of shame in his chest as these memories surfaced. Yet the book did not condemn him. Its words came like balm. Even the false yes has value, for it shows you what you do not want. Learn from it, grow into the true. As he walked home that night, he practiced listening for his silent yes. He asked himself, as he passed under the cathedral's shadow, do I stand here because I am afraid or because I am free? The answer stung him. Fear still ruled more often than he wished to admit. But even this recognition was power. Awareness is the first seed of freedom. He knew that if he kept asking the question, one day his yes would come from a place no threat could reach. The dangerous book described this journey as a shift from slavery to covenant. Slavery obeys from terror. Covenant obeys from love. Both may look similar, but one destroys the soul while the other gives it wings. A note in the margin, written by another anonymous reader, sharpened the point. Better a single yes from love than a lifetime of yeses from fear. That sentence carried the weight of a confession, perhaps written by someone who had lived most of their years under compulsion. The young man held his breath when he read it, as though the paper itself still carried the warmth of that regret. The silent yes became, for those who embraced it, a kind of compass. It guided choices both small and great. Should I speak now or remain quiet? Should I give this coin, this bread, this kindness? Should I marry this person, take this work, leave this town? The answer was not in law books or decrees. It was in the quiet question, does my yes rise from fear or from love? Only one of those births, truth. Only one of those endures. It was precisely this practice that terrified those in power. For once a man or woman discovered the silent, yes, they no longer bent easily. They might still appear compliant, but their souls had shifted. Authority could command the body, but not the heart. And hearts, once awake, spread fire to other hearts. That fire was more dangerous than any rebellion, for it spread without banners or leaders beyond walls and prisons. It spread through whispers, glances, acts of courage too small to punish but too bright to ignore. The young man later learned that entire communities had practiced the silent yes together. In towns where inquisitors prowled, people still gathered in secret, not to plot revolt, but to ask each other, did your yes today come from fear or from love? This was their liturgy. No hymns, no sermons, just the quiet practice of discernment. And from this soil grew resilience no sword could cut. That night, as he lay awake with the moonlight spilling across his ceiling, he whispered a vow. Not loud, not grand, just a breath into the dark. I will learn the yes that cannot be taken. It was his first step into freedom, his first step away from the masks of fear. And though no one else heard, though no one else marked the moment, the dangerous book had already changed the architecture of his soul. For revolutions do not always begin with shouts in the square. Sometimes they begin with silence. Sometimes they begin with a single yes, spoken only to oneself, and once spoken, the world cannot remain the same. The dangerous book never scorned ritual outright. It did not mock candles, dismiss prayers, or sneer at sacred gestures. It understood something deeper. Ritual is not the enemy, but the mask it wears can be. Ritual, stripped of meaning, becomes a chain. Ritual, infused with awareness, becomes a doorway. That was the truth the book dared to whisper, and that whisper was enough to shake the foundation of institutions that thrived on empty repetition. The young man who studied the book had grown up surrounded by ritual. Bells rang each morning, calling people to kneel. Incense swirled in heavy air. Words were recited in unison, the same syllables spoken for generations. He had memorized them all long before he understood their meaning. And yet, when he read the book's reflections, he saw those familiar gestures with new eyes. The text told him plainly, when the heart sleeps, the ritual dies. When the heart wakes, the ritual breathes. He thought back to times when he had stood in the cathedral, mouthing prayers as his mind wandered. His lips moved, his spirit drifted. He remembered how no one noticed. As long as the words left his mouth, as long as he appeared compliant, no one questioned whether his heart was present. That was the mask of ritual. It could make the absent look faithful, the fearful look devout, the hollow look whole. But then the book offered another vision. It told of a woman who lit a single candle each night, whispering only one word, gratitude. There were no choirs, no polished robes, no grand altars, only her and the flame. Yet she found herself transformed. Her small ritual carried weight because her heart leaned fully into it. She remembered, with every flicker, the presence of love. The candle was not magic. The word was not spell. They were reminders. They were signals to the soul. Wake, notice, return. The church feared such teachings because they placed power back into the hands of individuals. If ritual could be simple, personal, alive, if it could be as plain as lighting a candle or touching a stone, then priests were no longer the exclusive keepers of access to the divine. Anyone, anywhere, could craft their own doorway. And once people knew they could enter on their own, the gatekeepers were left with no gates to guard. The young man found notes in the margins that revealed how others had practiced. One reader wrote, "I kiss my children's foreheads each night. This is my Mass." Another scribbled, "I wash my hands slowly before sleep. This is my prayer." Simple acts became sacred through intention. The rituals were not borrowed from authorities, but grown from life itself. Bread, water, touch, silence, all became vessels of presence, and here lay the danger. Because if a mother's kiss could be Mass, if a worker's pause could be prayer, then the monopoly of sacredness shattered. The dangerous book did not abolish ritual, it democratized it. It revealed that holiness was never in the object, but in the awareness poured into it. The young man practiced this teaching in secret. Each morning, before stepping into the grey stone streets, he placed his hand on his chest, breathed deeply, and whispered, "Awake." It took only seconds, but it changed the quality of his day. He noticed how his mind steadied, how his eyes softened toward others. This became his ritual, invisible to everyone else, but alive within him. And in time, he realized he carried more reverence in that single breath than in years of chanting words he did not feel. The book warned, however, that ritual could never be frozen. It had to move with the heart. If repeated too long without attention, even the most meaningful gesture could turn hollow. When the vessel hardens, it said, pour it out and form another. That teaching terrified authorities. For them, frozen rituals were tools of control. They ensured conformity. They disguised obedience as devotion. To tell people that rituals could be changed, reshaped, or abandoned was to hand them keys to freedom. The margins confirmed that many readers had understood this. One line read, "I stopped kneeling. I now walk at dusk. Both are prayer." Another, "They told me to fast. I now feed the hungry. This is my fast." These words were not rebellion against the sacred, they were reclamation of it. The readers were not discarding holiness, they were rediscovering it in places the church could not regulate. The young man wrestled with these ideas. He feared he might be straying too far, that abandoning traditional rituals meant abandoning faith itself. But then he read a line that dissolved his fear. The holy is not fragile. You cannot lose it by leaving form. You only lose it by leaving love. That sentence struck him like lightning. He realized the divine was not bound to one gesture, one chant, one rite. Love was the true constant. Ritual was merely a reminder, a tool, a rhythm to return him to what mattered most. He began to imagine what life might look like if entire communities embraced ritual as reminder rather than command. Imagine a village gathering at sunset, not to recite what they were told, but to share aloud one thing they had noticed that day. Imagine a family breaking bread, not out of fear of divine punishment, but to remind themselves of gratitude. Imagine rituals born fresh each season, evolving as hearts evolved, instead of calcifying into lifeless monuments. This vision pulsed in him, like a song too dangerous to sing aloud. No wonder the book was suppressed, because it taught people that ritual was not the property of the church, it belonged to them. It was theirs to shape, theirs to live, theirs to carry into every corner of existence. And once they knew that, the power of authorities to dictate the shape of worship was undone. That night, as the young man set down the book, he whispered his own ritual into being. He touched the table, touched his forehead, and said softly, "Truth, enter." It was nothing anyone else would notice, but to him it was doorway enough. The dangerous book had already taught him that ritual, when born of love, needed no permission. It was reminder enough to keep the soul awake. And so he practiced, and with each practice, his life became less bound by fear and more infused with presence. That was the revolution the book offered. Not noisy riots, but quiet rituals, alive with meaning, that no power could strip away. Forgiveness was one of the most dangerous teachings in the book. not because people did not know of forgiveness, but because they had been taught a version that never truly healed. The official rituals of pardon often sounded like transaction. Confess here, repeat these words, pay this penance, and your slate is wiped clean. But beneath the surface, wounds remained. Shame lingered, relationships stayed cracked, people performed forgiveness without ever touching the root of it. The book spoke differently. It said forgiveness was not a ceremony to complete, but a transformation to embody. It taught that true forgiveness could not be traded, bought, or imposed. It had to be lived, and it had to stick. Otherwise, it was nothing more than paint on a broken wall. Forgiveness, the book whispered, is not words spoken in air, but patterns changed in flesh. The young man who read these lines felt them cut deep. He remembered times he had mouthed confessions without ever feeling free. He remembered leaving dark wooden booths, still carrying the same heaviness he brought in. He remembered how guilt would creep back like weeds, strangling the small relief the ritual had given him. He knew in his bones what the book meant. Forgiveness that does not stick is not forgiveness at all. It is postponement. The book outlined 4 movements, though it never called them steps, as if afraid of sounding like a manual. First, name. Second, feel. Third, release. Fourth, repair. These were not laws, but rhythms, reminders of how to walk through the tangled forest of pain. Name. You cannot forgive what you refuse to face. Naming is not about blaming others or yourself. It is about calling the wound by its true name. Pretending it was smaller, pretending it did not matter, only buried poison deeper. Naming lifted it into the light where healing could begin. Feel. Once named, the pain had to be felt, not avoided, not drowned in distractions, not smothered by forced cheerfulness. The book said, "What you do not feel, you cannot heal." Many feared this stage because the emotions felt like fire. But the book promised, feel fully, and the fire burns clean. Refuse to feel, and the embers smoulder for years. Release. To forgive was not to excuse, not to deny, not to say the wound was good. It was to open the clenched fist around the memory and let it breathe. The book described it as opening a window in a suffocating room. Release did not mean forgetting. It meant refusing to keep inhaling the same stale air. Repair, forgiveness that stops at release, risks being selfish. True forgiveness asks what can be restored. It may not always be the relationship sometimes that is gone forever, but something must be rebuilt. Trust in oneself, courage to walk forward, or perhaps the bridge between people if both are willing. Without repair, forgiveness remains fragile, too easily shattered by the next storm. The young man read these movements again and again, feeling his chest tighten. He thought of someone he had not forgiven, an old friend who betrayed his trust. He had told himself many times he was over it, yet, whenever he saw the man's face in memory, bitterness rose. He realized he had never truly named what had hurt him. He had hidden it under vague words like misunderstanding. He had never allowed himself to feel the sting of betrayal. He had rushed toward release without walking through the first 2 movements. No wonder it had never stuck. In the margin beside these passages, a reader centuries before had written, "Forgiveness that is shallow breaks. Forgiveness that is deep grows." Another note, scrawled in shakier hand, "I forgave my brother this way. Now he is free, and so am I." These testimonies were proof that the method was not theory, it was lived reality. The Church feared such teaching because it bypassed their control. If forgiveness could be lived directly, then confessions whispered to a priest were no longer the only gateway. People could forgive in their homes, their fields, their daily lives. They could release and repair without intermediaries. The economy of guilt, one of the strongest currencies of control, would collapse. That was why this chapter was so dangerous. It gave people back their power to heal. The young man tried the 4 movements that very night. He sat at his small table, lit a candle, and whispered the name of the wound. He allowed himself to feel the sting without flinching. He wept, quietly, for the first time in years. Then he opened his hands, as if releasing a bird, whispering, "I will not carry you any more." And finally, he vowed to repair, not by chasing reconciliation, but by tending his own heart with honesty. He slept lighter that night, as if a stone had been lifted from his chest. The book did not promise forgiveness was simple. It said it might take days, months, or years. Some wounds might need to be named and felt 100 times before release was real. But it assured its readers that each honest attempt weakened the chain of resentment. Each small release created space for love to breathe. Forgiveness that sticks is terrifying to those who rule by fear, because once you are free inside, threats lose their teeth. If shame no longer binds you, commands built on guilt collapse. You no longer kneel because you dread punishment. You stand or kneel because love calls you. That is a freedom no authority can control. And so, in hushed tones and trembling hands, readers across centuries practiced this hidden art. They forgave fathers, mothers, children, neighbours. They forgave themselves. And every time forgiveness stuck, another chain rattled loose from the world's grip. The dangerous book often spoke in parables, small human stories that slipped past defences and went straight into the heart. One such story, copied and recopied through centuries, was about a teacher who lived in a village by the river. He owned no wealth, no fine house, no land to his name. What he carried was a way of seeing that made ordinary life shine with quiet meaning. His students were not cloistered monks or noble scholars. They were children, farmers, widows and wanderers, anyone who was willing to listen. The villagers whispered that he was dangerous, though he carried no sword. His danger was that he taught people to notice for themselves. Instead of answering their questions with doctrine, he asked them what they saw, what they felt, what their conscience whispered when silence grew long. He refused to let them hide behind memorized answers. He demanded they risk their own sight. The church at the time hated such figures. They thrived on rules that bent minds into obedience, rules written in stone, cold and immovable. But the teacher's rule was different. It was not carved on tablets or bound into decrees. It was carved into the living practice of awareness. It was short, almost childlike, yet impossible to twist into fear. His rule was this: do not do what kills love within you. When the young man who now read the dangerous book in the archive came upon that line, he paused. He read it again. The words looked almost too simple, like a saying a child might invent, yet the more he lingered on them, the heavier they became. Do not do what kills love within you, not obey these leaders, not perform this ritual, not fear this punishment, only protect love as if it were the breath of your soul. He closed his eyes and tried to imagine what his life would look like if he followed only that rule. He thought of the times he had said words he did not mean to satisfy authority. He thought of the times he had betrayed himself to win safety. He thought of the nights when silence pressed on him because he had chosen comfort over truth. Each of those moments, he realized, had killed a little flame inside him. He had lived by fear's rules. The teacher's rule invited him to live by love's flame instead. The book told how the teacher once gathered the village children by the river. He handed each of them a small candle and said, "This is your heart. The world will try to blow it out, protect it, shield it, and when it grows dim, find someone else whose flame is still strong, and light yours again." The children laughed, thinking it a game. But years later, when storms came, when soldiers marched through, when famine struck, they remembered. They lit each other's flames in kitchens, in fields, in darkened rooms. The rule lived not as law, but as practice. The margins of the book were full of echoes of this story. One reader scrawled, "Today I kept silent, and love died a little in me." Another wrote, "I spoke though afraid, love grew." These were not the words of rebels carrying banners. These were the quiet confessions of ordinary people testing the teacher's rule in daily life. And what terrified authorities most was that such a rule needed no permission, no priests, no rituals. It could be lived anywhere, by anyone, at any time. The young man thought of the classrooms he had once sat in, where teachers demanded memorization and punished questions. He thought of how alive he had felt the rare times a teacher asked, "What do you see?" Now, holding this book, he realized that those rare moments had carried the same spirit as the river teacher's rule. They had been small sparks of freedom, moments when love breathed instead of suffocated. The book explained that rules written by fear always multiply. 10 become 100, 100 become 1,000, until the weight crushes the spirit. But the teacher's rule distilled everything into one. Protect love within you, and all else will fall into place. Steal, it kills love. Lie, it kills love. Betray yourself, it kills love. But care, create, forgive, speak truth, these make love stronger. A life shaped by that compass needs no endless laws. The young man sensed why this rule had been hunted. Systems of power require complexity. They require endless rules, so that people feel too small, too ignorant, too dependent to guide themselves. Simplify truth into a single flame and the system crumbles. People no longer bow because they are afraid of breaking hidden decrees. They stand because they know how to guard what matters most. One night, after reading and rereading the chapter, the young man tried to live by the rule. He returned home to find his neighbour waiting, anger flashing in her eyes. She accused him of neglecting some duty, of breaking a custom he had not kept. Normally, he would have bowed, apologised quickly, anything to ease tension. But he asked himself, would that kill love within me? And he saw, to his surprise, that it would. Because it would be another false yes, another betrayal of his own truth. So he spoke calmly, "No, I did not neglect it. I chose differently." The words trembled, but he said them. His neighbour stormed away. Fear screamed in his chest. But beneath the fear, something else burned brighter. Love. Not sentimental love, not affection toward her in that moment, but love of truth, love of his own flame. And he realized the teacher's rule had guided him through a test he would have failed before. Forged in secret, hidden for centuries, the teacher's rule still lived. It lived because it could not be silenced. A rule written in books can be burned. A rule written in law can be revoked. But a rule written in the heart, practiced in kitchens and fields, whispered between children by candlelight, that rule cannot be erased. And so the young man understood. The dangerous book was not dangerous because it told people what to think. It was dangerous because it taught them how to guard their own flame. It gave them the teacher's rule, a compass that no authority could twist. It gave them back themselves. The fire was meant to purify. At least, that was the word the priests used when they ordered the townspeople to gather in the square. They called it a cleansing, a ritual to protect the faithful from corruption. But everyone who stood beneath the cold stars that night knew what it really was: fear disguised as holiness. The pile of books in the centre of the square looked almost alive. Leather covers cracked and curled under the torchlight. Pages fluttered like the wings of trapped birds whenever the night wind passed through them. The villagers stared in silence, some with relief that they were not the ones accused, others with sorrow that the words they loved were about to turn into smoke. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, asking why the priests hated paper. No one answered. The young man had heard rumours of burnings before, but this was the first time he had seen one with his own eyes. He felt the weight of the dangerous book hidden beneath his tunic, pressed against his ribs like a secret heartbeat. He had not dared leave it at home. He did not trust the searchers. Better to carry it close, even if it meant risking discovery. When the torches touched the pile, the flames leapt like wild animals finally unchained. The smell of burning ink filled the air, sharp and bitter. Pages twisted, blackened, and then burst into embers that rose skyward, carried off like tiny souls escaping their prison. Some of the villagers crossed themselves, others turned away. But the young man kept watching, eyes wide, because he knew what he was seeing was more than destruction. It was revelation. The fire consumed paper, but it could not consume memory. He thought of the words he had copied into his notebook, the lines etched into his heart. He thought of the margin notes scrawled by trembling hands centuries before. Those could not be burned. Those had already seeped into living flesh, and in that moment he understood why the priests looked so grim. They knew fire was not enough. They knew the book had already slipped past them, carried in whispers, in memory, in love. A single ember drifted toward him and landed on the cobblestones at his feet. He bent quickly, pretending to brush dirt from his shoe, and snatched it into his palm. The coal glowed red for an instant before dying into black, but the warmth lingered. He closed his fist around it as if to keep the fire alive. For the rest of his life, he would remember that heat, not as destruction, but as promise. In the margins of one surviving copy of the book, a witness to another burning had written, "They thought fire could silence, but fire only spread the truth into air." Another reader had added beneath it, "I breathed in the smoke, and now it lives in me." Those lines haunted the young man as he walked away from the square that night. He wondered how many others had carried the smoke of truth in their lungs, unwilling to let it die. The danger of Bonfire Night was not that books were destroyed, it was that people learned to fear being seen with them. Fear worked deeper than flames. Fear burned the courage of readers long before the torch touched the page. That was why the authorities staged the burnings in public squares, with drums and bells and sermons. They wanted fear to soak into every watching child, every trembling parent. They wanted obedience written into memory as smoke filled the sky. But the book itself had warned of this tactic. It said, "When fear rises in crowds, remember the flame that burns quiet in you. Their fire dies in ashes. Yours endures." The young man repeated those words silently as he watched the pile collapse into glowing embers. He felt torn between grief and defiance. Grief because centuries of thought had been turned to ash. Defiance because he now knew that ash itself could carry seeds. That night, as he walked home, he whispered a vow. He promised the book itself, though it could not hear, that he would never let its fire die in him. He would carry its words through fear, through silence, through the long shadows of power. And as long as even one reader remembered, the bonfires would never win. The dangerous book never pretended that freedom was without risk. It did not promise perfection, nor did it imagine that those who lived by love would never stumble. In fact, it warned that errors would be made often, perhaps more often than before, because freedom meant choice, and choice meant responsibility. But the book also carried a promise just as radical. Mistakes need not destroy you if they are followed by repair. The Church's system of fear thrived on error. It taught that mistakes left permanent stains that only priests could wash away, often at a cost. Guilt became a currency. People were trained to live small, to avoid risk, to obey without question, for fear that any misstep might condemn them forever. But the dangerous book shattered that cage. It taught that error was not the end, but the beginning of repair, and repair was the soil in which true freedom could grow. The young man who held the book close to his chest felt this truth like a spark under his ribs. He had carried guilt for years, small betrayals of his own conscience, words spoken that he did not mean, moments when he bowed to fear instead of love. He thought these failures had branded him forever, that he was unworthy to walk freely because he had stumbled before. But here, In the fragile ink of forbidden pages, he read a different story. Error is the crack where light enters. Repair is the hand that shapes the crack into a doorway. He lingered on that sentence until his throat tightened. The idea that error could be redeemed, not erased, but transformed, felt like water in a desert. He realized how much of his life had been built around avoiding mistakes at all costs, but avoidance had kept him small, timid, half alive. Repair offered something different, the courage to live boldly, knowing that even when he fell, there was a way to rise. The book described error as inevitable, like stumbling on a path. The danger was not in the stumble itself, but in refusing to rise again, or worse, pretending you had never stumbled at all, pretending bred dishonesty, denial hardened into pride. Only by admitting the fall could repair begin. The book called this honesty the first grace, for it opened the heart to change. Repair, the book explained, had 3 faces. First was confession, not the ritual kind whispered to a priest in exchange for penance, but the raw honesty of facing those you had harmed, including yourself. Confession was naming the truth aloud, letting it stand in the air without disguise. Second was restitution, not always material, but always tangible. To repair meant to restore what could be restored, whether bread, trust, or dignity. Third was renewal, the deliberate choice to live differently, to carve a new path that prevented the wound from reopening. In the margins, a trembling hand had written centuries ago, "I betrayed my friend. I confessed. I repaired. Now our bond is stronger than before." Another line, sharper and darker, said, "I denied repair once. The wound swallowed me." These testimonies brought the teaching to life. They proved that repair was not philosophy, but practice, sometimes painful, sometimes humbling, always necessary. The young man thought of his own betrayals. He remembered a time he had spoken harshly to a neighbour, more from fear than malice, yet the words had cut deep. He had never apologised, telling himself it was too late, that the silence was safer. Now he realised that silence had been a cage, trapping both of them in unfinished pain. He resolved, trembling, that he would seek her out, admit his failure, and offer repair. The thought terrified him, but beneath the fear, he felt something larger, an ember of freedom, glowing warmer. The book was honest about the cost. Repair could not always restore what was lost. Some wounds scarred permanently. Some relationships ended despite effort. But even when the outer repair failed, the inner act of honesty transformed the soul. Repair does not guarantee restoration of others, the book said, but it always restores yourself. That line sank into him like a stone dropped into a deep well. The authorities despised this teaching because it made their control unnecessary. If repair could be lived directly between people, if forgiveness and restoration could unfold without ritual intermediaries, then the elaborate machinery of guilt collapsed. No more endless confessions traded for absolution. No more dependence on fear to keep the faithful obedient. Repair gave power back to the hands of those who erred, those who forgave, those who chose to live again. It dismantled the economy of shame on which so much authority depended. The young man imagined what a community shaped by this teaching might look like. Neighbours quick to admit faults instead of hiding them. Families practicing repair at the dinner table, not waiting for priests to absolve them. Children raised to know that mistakes did not make them unworthy, but invited them to grow. Such a village would not be free of pain, but it would be alive with resilience, honesty, and love that endured through trial. He imagined such a world, and tears blurred his eyes because he had glimpsed how different it was from the one he lived in. That night, he whispered a vow. He promised that he would no longer live shrinking from mistakes. He would live boldly, and when he failed, as he surely would, he would practice repair instead of hiding. He would confess, restore, renew. and he would trust that this path, though narrow, would lead him closer to love than fear ever had. For the dangerous book knew what authorities feared to admit. People do not need to be perfect to be free. They only need to learn how to repair. And once they know that, no amount of fear, no threat of punishment can ever chain them again. The dangerous book often spoke of voices, not the loud voices that thundered from pulpits or echoed in stone halls, but the quiet ones, the ones that hummed beneath the surface of daily life. It taught that truth rarely shouts. Instead, it sings softly, like a hidden choir that only those willing to listen can hear. The young man first noticed this after months of carrying the book in secret. At first, he had felt alone, certain that no one else around him could possibly know the words he was reading, the freedom he was beginning to taste. But then small signs began to appear, like notes carried on the wind, a phrase spoken casually by a baker echoing the book's rhythm, a symbol carved discreetly into the wood of a neighbour's door, a pause in a conversation, heavy with recognition, as if two souls had heard the same song. He realized slowly that he was not alone. Others carried the same flame. They too had read or heard whispers, or remembered lines etched in their ancestors' voices. Together, though hidden from each other by fear, they formed a secret harmony. They were the hidden choir. The book had predicted this. It said, "Truth, once awakened, calls to itself. One voice awakens another. And though each sings softly, together they shake the walls." This was no metaphor for him anymore. He felt it in his bones. He felt it when he looked into a stranger's eyes and sensed the unspoken. He felt it when someone lingered too long on words of love and freedom, as if testing whether it was safe to sing louder. The hidden choir never gathered in public. They did not march or shout. They hummed in kitchens, whispered in barns, prayed in fields. Their song was not uniform. Each voice carried its own tone, its own words, its own way of embodying the truth. Yet beneath the differences, there was resonance, a deep chord of recognition. This was what made the book truly dangerous. It did not build armies, it awakened choirs. And choirs cannot be chained. The young man began to hear it even in silence. Walking home through the narrow streets, he noticed how lamplight fell on stone in patterns that reminded him of the book's phrases. Sitting at a table with neighbours, he noticed how one look, one smile, could carry volumes unspoken. It was as though the world itself had begun to hum with the same song. Once tuned to it, he could not unhear it. The authorities, of course, feared this most of all. They could silence individuals, burn books, erase sermons, but they could not silence a choir that lived inside countless ordinary lives. They could not stop voices that did not need permission, that carried themselves in glances, gestures, acts of courage too small to punish. One priest had once admitted, in frustration, "It is like chasing wind. We strike one, and 3 more whisper. We burn 10, and 100 breathe the smoke." The margins of the book were filled with evidence of this hidden choir. One reader centuries earlier had written, "I thought I was alone. Then I heard her hum the line while she baked bread. I am not alone." Another wrote, "We speak in symbols on the walls. We will not be silenced." These were not merely notes. They were echoes of the choir singing across time, their harmony reaching anyone willing to join. The young man, once timid and fearful, began to find courage in this realization. He no longer felt like a solitary rebel. He felt like a single voice in a vast song. His part might be small, but it mattered. It mattered because every voice strengthened the resonance. Every whisper weakened the chains. Every act of quiet courage added another note to the hidden hymn. He began to practice listening differently. Instead of rushing through conversations, he lingered for the undertones. Instead of dismissing small gestures, he studied them for meaning. He discovered that truth often travelled disguised in ordinary life. A farmer's story about soil became a parable about resilience. A mother's lullaby became a declaration of hope. A merchant's refusal to cheat a customer became an act of resistance against fear. The dangerous book taught him to trust these small notes. It reminded him that choirs are built not by soloists, but by many voices blending. He realized he did not need to lead, nor did anyone else. The power lay in the harmony itself, and harmony, once awakened, could topple even the loudest tyrant. He remembered one night when a storm swept through the village, lightning flashing across the sky, thunder rolling like drums. The people huddled indoors, candles flickering. From his window, he heard it soft at first, then stronger. Neighbours singing, one after another, voices weaving through the storm. Not hymns approved by the church, but fragments of old songs, lullabies, phrases that carried the echo of freedom. He joined in quietly, his voice blending with theirs. It was then he knew the hidden choir was real, not metaphor, not hope, reality. And he realized too why the book was hunted. Because you cannot stop a choir by silencing one voice. You cannot silence a harmony once it has entered the hearts of the people. You can burn pages, but you cannot burn echoes. You can forbid gatherings, but you cannot forbid glances, nods, songs whispered to children at night. You can strike fear, but you cannot strike down love when it multiplies itself in sound. The dangerous book was dangerous not because it created followers, but because it awakened singers. And singers, once awake, never stop. The book itself never demanded allegiance. It did not ask for loyalty to an institution or obedience to a creed. Instead, it invited every reader to consider what it meant to live awake. And somewhere in its latter pages, faded from years of hands turning, the young man discovered what earlier generations had called the reader's oath. It was not written like a command, but more like a whisper, a suggestion of what one might choose to vow once the words had already changed them. The lines were simple. I will not close my eyes. Once opened, I will not trade love for fear. I will not hoard truth, but let it flow. When the young man first read those sentences, he felt the air around him grow heavier. He realized this was not poetry for decoration, it was invitation. Those who read and chose to speak this oath were no longer the same. They carried something within them that no law could erase. And because of this, the oath was more dangerous than the book itself. In the margins, one hand had written, I spoke these words aloud, now they burn in me. Another wrote, I taught them to my son. He will never kneel to fear. These were not mere scribbles. They were echoes of lives transformed. Each oath was like a seed planted, growing in silence, spreading roots deep into unseen soil. The young man wondered whether he was ready to make such a vow. He had read much already, had felt his heart tremble with new freedom, but he also knew the risk. To take this oath was to set aside excuses. It meant he could no longer plead ignorance when fear tried to disguise itself. It meant he could not return to the safety of sleep once his eyes had seen. That night, sitting in his small room by the dim glow of a candle, he repeated the words under his breath. His voice trembled, but he spoke them fully. I will not close my eyes once opened. I will not trade love for fear. I will not hoard truth, but let it flow. As the syllables left his lips, he felt something shift. It was not dramatic, no thunder cracking, no light flooding the room. But inside, he knew he had crossed a line. He belonged now to the living chain of readers who had spoken those words across centuries. The book reminded him that oaths are not chains. They are not meant to bind, but to guide. The danger comes not from the vow itself, but from the courage it demands. Once spoken, the oath lingers in memory. It returns in moments of choice, asking, will you open your eyes, or will you close them again? Will you protect love, or will you let fear consume it? Will you share what you know, or will you bury it for safety? The questions haunt, but they also empower. The young man tested his oath quickly. A neighbour mocked him for refusing to join a ritual he no longer believed in. The old him would have lowered his head, muttered apology, and complied. But the words of his vow echoed in him. I will not trade love for fear, and so he stood firm, gently but clearly, saying, No, not this time. His voice shook, but he kept his eyes steady. The neighbour spat, muttered a curse, and walked away. Yet, within, the young man felt stronger, freer, more alive than ever before. The book warned that the oath would often isolate. Those who chose it might lose friends, family, community, but it also promised that the hidden choir would always welcome them, that the oath created a bond stronger than blood. Across time and place, anyone who spoke those words became part of an unseen fellowship, bound not by ritual, but by truth itself. He began to sense this fellowship. He saw it in the quick glance of a woman at the market, who seemed to recognize his refusal to kneel. He felt it in the old man, who slipped him a scrap of paper with a single word written on it. Awake. He realized the oath marked him not only to himself, but to others who had spoken it too. They could see each other without needing to speak. That silent recognition was both comfort and call. One night, he opened the book again and found a margin note that nearly undid him. It read, If you speak this oath, know you may lose much, but know also you will gain yourself. He traced the words with his finger, tears stinging his eyes. He thought of the weight he already carried, the fear, the uncertainty, the loneliness. And yet he knew the note was right. What he had gained was worth more than anything he might lose. He had gained himself. The reader's oath was the final shield against fear. Not because it promised safety, it did not. Not because it guaranteed victory, it did not. It was shield because it reminded the reader of who they were when everything else tried to strip them bare. And so long as they remembered, the flame could not die. The young man whispered the vow again before sleep, not as duty, but as reminder. And as he drifted into dreams, he wondered how many others were whispering the same words in that very moment, scattered across villages, across centuries, across the long shadows of history. He did not feel alone anymore. He felt part of a chain unbroken, a choir unseen, a current of love, stronger than fire, stronger than fear. He had become, fully, a reader. The dangerous book was never meant to survive in one place. It moved like water, seeping into cracks, flowing where it was least expected, carrying its truth into the most hidden corners of human life. And where the official church raised walls and guards, the book responded with whispers. Whisper networks became its lifeline. They were fragile in appearance, yet unbreakable in essence. The young man discovered this not in the grand halls of learning, but in the back room of a bakery. He had gone there only to buy bread, his mind heavy with the risk of being discovered carrying his copy of the book beneath his cloak. But when the baker leaned closer and muttered a line under his breath, I will not close my eyes once opened, the young man froze. It was the oath, spoken like a password, spoken like a song. The baker looked him in the eye, then quickly shifted back to kneading dough. Nothing more was said. But in that brief moment, the young man realized he was standing inside the edges of a whisper network, invisible to the untrained, undeniable to those who had ears to hear. The dangerous book had described these networks obliquely. It never gave instructions, never listed names, never mapped out connections. Instead, it offered principles. When fear watches, speak in seeds. When fire hunts, carry embers in your breath. When silence rules, trust the nod, the glance, the pause. These were not metaphors to its readers. They were survival codes. A nod could be agreement. A glance could be warning. A pause could be permission. And thus the book spread, not by public proclamation, but by threads of recognition woven through daily life. The margins of the copy the young man carried were full of evidence of these networks. One note read, "We meet at dusk, never more than 3, never in the same place twice." Another scribbled line, "Write in recipes, in letters, in songs. They cannot ban what they cannot see." The notes felt alive, pulsing with the ingenuity of countless unnamed readers who had carried the truth forward when silence seemed absolute. The young man began to notice how these networks pulsed even in his own village. A weaver who hummed a melody containing the rhythm of a forbidden phrase. A child who drew symbols in dirt, quickly erased with her foot. A traveller who left coins stacked in patterns that spelled words no one else noticed. The signs were everywhere, once you tuned your eyes to them, and with each discovery, his sense of isolation thinned. He was part of something vast, something both fragile and unstoppable. Whisper networks were not safe. Discovery meant punishment. Informers prowled. Priests listened for slips. Yet, these networks endured because they carried more than survival. They carried belonging. In a world where fear isolated, whispers reconnected. To exchange even a single line from the book was to remember, I am not alone. That simple truth gave strength enough to withstand interrogations, prisons, even flames. One story in the book told of a village where a child was accused of carrying fragments of forbidden text. When questioned, she pretended ignorance, but the next day, as she played in the street, she skipped to a rhythm that matched one of the book's lines. Other children joined, chanting nonsense syllables that, when pieced together, spelled the truth. The inquisitors heard only children's play. The network lived on. Another story told of a seamstress who stitched phrases into hems, hidden from view. When her garments travelled to neighbouring towns, so did the words. Her thread became scripture. Her craft became rebellion. The church wore those garments unknowingly, their robes lined with words they had forbidden. The dangerous book laughed softly through her stitches. The young man longed to become part of these networks, but he knew they tested newcomers carefully. One false step, one unwise word, could bring destruction. So he practiced patience. He listened more than he spoke. He offered small signals, a phrase muttered under breath, a symbol scratched into wood. Slowly, carefully, others began to answer. He learned to hear the hidden choir not only in voices but in actions. A loaf given freely, a hand pressed too long, a candle placed at the right window. He began to realize that whisper networks were not merely about passing words, they were about embodying them. Every gesture of love, every act of courage, every refusal to bow to fear became part of the song. The book itself said, "A truth hidden in whispers grows louder than a lie shouted from towers." And indeed, that was what frightened authorities most. They controlled pulpits, proclamations, laws. But whispers spread deeper, like roots under soil, preparing to crack stone from below. The young man remembered the baker who had spoken the oath. Weeks later, he returned to the shop, and this time, the baker slipped him a loaf heavier than it should have been. Inside the crust, folded in cloth, lay a fragment of text written in cramped hand. It was a story he had not yet read, copied from another version of the book. His chest swelled with awe. The network had trusted him. The choir had accepted his voice. That night, as he read the fragment by candlelight, he realized that the dangerous book was not bound to one copy, not limited to leather and ink. It lived in fragments, scattered, hidden, carried in whispers and gestures. No fire could consume it because it was everywhere, in everyone who dared to carry it forward. And as he lay in bed, the young man thought of how many others were passing fragments that very night, scribbling in margins, stitching in hems, humming in kitchens, stacking coins in coded patterns. He smiled, for he knew now that the book's true power was not its pages, but its people. The dangerous book had become a living network, a web of whispers stronger than fear. And once a whisper begins, it can never truly be silenced. The square still smelled of smoke long after the fire had died. The air carried that acrid tang of charred leather and ink, as though the words themselves had left a ghost behind. Children kicked at the blackened ground where embers once glowed. Merchants set up their stalls as if nothing had happened. But the young man stood still, staring at the ashes, feeling the weight of what he had seen, another burning, another attempt to silence the dangerous book, another declaration that fear had triumphed. The priests had spoken loudly that night, their voices echoing against the cathedral walls. They declared victory, insisting that truth had been defended, heresy destroyed, purity restored. But as the flames devoured the pages, the young man had noticed something the priests had not: seeds. Not literal seeds, but sparks carried by the embers. As the pages curled and blackened, fragments of words had lifted into the air, glowing orange before dissolving into ash. For a moment, it had looked like the sky itself was filled with tiny lanterns. People gasped at the sight, not with awe, but with something else, a flicker of recognition, as though each ember carried a truth too stubborn to die. The book had spoken of this. "They will burn us to ash," one passage said, "but ash feeds the soil, and in that soil new seeds grow." The young man clung to that line now as he stood among the remnants. He realized that the fire had not destroyed the book, it had scattered it. Each ember that rose into the night sky was a reminder, a spark that might settle into memory, into whispers, into the quiet courage of those who had seen. He thought of the baker, who had once slipped him a fragment hidden inside bread. He thought of the seamstress, who stitched phrases into hems. He thought of the children, who skipped to forbidden rhythms in the street. The book did not need a single unbroken volume to survive. It had already taken root in lives. It had already been scattered like seeds into countless hidden soils. The young man knelt, scooping a handful of ashes into his palm. The flakes clung to his skin, staining him black. He rubbed them between his fingers and whispered, "You are not gone. You are planted." It was not a prayer in the way priests demanded, but it was holy all the same. As he walked away, he carried some of the ash in a small pouch. He did not know why, perhaps as relic, perhaps as reminder, perhaps as symbol. Later, he would sprinkle some in his own garden, among the rows of herbs and beans. And when green shoots rose weeks later, he would think of them as the book reborn, its words flowering in silence, its truth embodied in growth. In the margins of his copy, one earlier reader had written, "Ashes are not the end, they are the beginning of roots unseen." Another had scrawled, "We scatter what they burn, we rise where they fall." These margin notes carried more fire than the sermons of priests, because they carried hope, hope that fire could never consume love, hope that destruction could never undo what had already entered human hearts. The young man realized that ashes always frighten the destroyer more than the destroyed, for ashes spread. Ashes travel on wind. Ashes cannot be gathered once scattered. A single book could be chained, guarded, burned, but once it had turned to ash, it was everywhere, and everywhere meant unstoppable. That night, he lit a small fire in his own hearth. He placed the pouch of ashes beside it and whispered to himself the lines he had memorized. "Fear builds towers. Love scatters seeds. Towers fall, seeds endure." His voice trembled, but the tremble felt alive. He knew he was not speaking only for himself. He was part of something larger, a hidden garden growing in the cracks of a crumbling empire. The authorities would never understand this. They thought power was in walls, in flames, in decrees. They thought truth could be erased by fire, but truth had always been seed, and seed knows only how to grow. The young man had begun to believe he had already uncovered all the book's mysteries. He had read every page, traced every margin note, whispered every oath. But one evening, by the faint light of a candle, he noticed something strange. A section near the back looked thicker than the rest. The pages did not lie flat. they seemed to conceal a space between them. His hands trembled as he pressed along the seam. Then, with a soft crack, the binding loosened. A folded sheet slipped out. It was not written in the same careful script as the rest of the book. The ink was faded, the letters uneven, as if written in haste. At first, he thought it was a fragment of scripture, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized it was something different, a map. Not of mountains or rivers, but of truths scattered like landmarks across the soul. The map began with a circle drawn at the top, labelled Origin. From there, lines branched outward, leading to words fear, obedience, silence. Each of these was linked to other words, chains, shame, control. But then, faintly, almost erased by time, another line curved away from origin. It led not to fear, but to love. And from love sprang new paths, courage, forgiveness, vision, song. The young man traced the lines with his finger. The map revealed the two great routes every life could travel, the path of fear and the path of love. Both began at the same origin, but they diverged at choice. And once chosen, each unfolded into an entirely different world. In the margins of the map, someone had written, "Walk the love path. Even in darkness, it shines." Another note, "This is the true compass. Burn the rest, you cannot burn this." He realized then why this page had been hidden. It was too clear, too direct. Anyone could understand it. Even a child could follow its meaning. The priests could argue against parables, twist metaphors, declare sermons heresy. But a map needed no interpreter. It spoke plainly. It was impossible to confuse, and that clarity was dangerous. The young man stared at the map long into the night. He thought of his own life. How many times had he chosen the path of fear? How often had obedience, silence, and shame bent his steps? He felt sorrow at the memory, yet also relief, for the map did not condemn him for his past. It simply showed him another way. The path of love was still there, waiting. He tested it the next morning. When a merchant tried to cheat him in the marketplace, his instinct was to stay silent, to avoid conflict. That was the fear path. But he remembered the map. He took a breath and spoke gently but firmly, naming the truth. The merchant frowned, then relented. And though his voice had trembled, the young man felt stronger. Courage had sprouted from love. That evening, he visited his neighbour, the one he had once spoken harshly to. His chest tightened as he knocked on her door. When she opened it, suspicion in her eyes, he bowed his head and admitted his fault. He asked forgiveness, not as ritual, but as truth. To his surprise, her eyes softened. She nodded slowly. Forgiveness sprouted from love. With each step, he realized the map was more than ink. It was alive, etched into the fabric of the world. Each choice bent him toward fear or toward love. And the more he walked one path, the easier it became to keep walking it. The book had hinted at this before, but the map laid it bare. Life itself was a landscape, and every soul was a traveller. The authorities would have hated this. They thrived on making paths confusing, convincing people that only priests could guide them, that only rituals could save them. But this map stripped all that away. It showed that the journey was simple. Choose love, and freedom follows. Choose fear, and chains tighten. No priest required, no ceremony necessary. Just the courage to choose. The young man copied the map carefully onto scraps of parchment. He left one folded inside a loaf of bread at the baker's. He pressed another into the palm of a child, disguised as a drawing game. He etched a crude version into the dirt of a field where travellers rested. He knew discovery could mean punishment, but he also knew the map was too important to keep hidden. One night, as he lay awake, he wondered how many others had found their own hidden maps across the centuries. He imagined countless readers tracing the same lines, whispering the same vow, "I will walk the love path." And he realized that the map was not confined to paper. It had been carried in hearts long before ink touched parchment. The hidden page was simply a reminder of what souls already knew. He placed the map back inside the book, folded carefully, pressed against his heart. And he whispered, "I choose love." The words were not loud, but they were enough to redraw the course of his life. The secret map was never meant to chart mountains or seas. It was meant to chart the unseen. And once revealed, no fire could consume it, no chain could bind it. For the truest maps are the ones written not in ink, but in the choices we carry into tomorrow. The streets were lined with torches that night, flames swaying in the wind, shadows crawling across the stone walls like restless spirits. People had been ordered to gather. The priests called it a procession of purity. They claimed it was meant to drive out heresy, to restore order, to remind the people of obedience. But as the crowd filled the square, silence pressed heavier than any sermon could. The young man stood among them, his cloak pulled tight, the dangerous book hidden beneath the folds of cloth. He felt the tension like a string stretched too tight. Soldiers lined the edges, their armor glinting, their eyes scanning for defiance. At the front of the crowd, a long table displayed confiscated objects, charms, letters, fragments of books. Each one had been declared forbidden. Each one was about to be burned. But before the torches touched the pile, something unexpected happened. The priests raised their hands to command silence. Yet the silence was already there. It was not obedience, it was resistance. No chants, no murmurs, no prayers rose from the crowd. Only the shuffle of feet, only the crackle of fire, only the stillness of a people who had chosen to withhold their voices. The young man realized it then. This was not fear. This was choice. This was the hidden choir, refusing to sing the words demanded of them. It was a silence so thick it frightened the priests. For silence cannot be commanded, it can only be given. And once people withdraw their voices, power crumbles. One old woman near the front folded her hands and bowed her head, but she did not mouth the prayers the priests began to recite. A child clutched his mother's sleeve, wide-eyed, watching as men in robes shouted words that fell flat into the air. No echo answered them. The silence became heavier still, like a weight pressing down on every chest. The book had written of this. When fear commands words, let silence be your hymn, for silence speaks louder than chains. And the young man knew he was witnessing that hymn now, a procession not of purity but of defiance, a liturgy of quiet that no authority could twist. The priests grew uneasy, their chants faltered. One struck the table with his staff, demanding voices. None came. The soldiers shifted, uncertain. Even the flames seemed to burn weaker, without the fuel of human agreement. And in that moment, the young man saw the truth. Power without consent is hollow. Fear may compel bodies to gather, but it cannot compel hearts to sing. In the margin of his copy of the book, someone long ago had written, "We marched, but we did not speak. They could not bear it." Another hand added, "Silence cracked their stone louder than any shout." The young man felt those words living again in this very square. Then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, someone began to hum. Not loud, not obvious, just a single note, like the beginning of a song. Heads turned, searching for the source, but it was swallowed by the silence. Another note followed, from somewhere else. Then another. The sound was fragile, almost nothing. Yet together it grew into a thread weaving through the crowd. It was not melody, not hymn, but something deeper, a reminder that silence itself could give birth to song when the moment demanded. The priests grew pale. They raised their hands again, but no one obeyed. The hum grew into resonance, not loud enough to be declared rebellion, yet too alive to be ignored. The young man added his voice, barely audible, his throat trembling with both fear and fire. He realized then that silence and sound were not opposites, they were allies. Silence withheld gave power, sound given sparingly, softly, transformed it. The soldiers looked at one another, uneasy. The flames consumed the forbidden objects on the table, but no one wept, no one begged, no one shouted. Instead, the hum continued, steady as heartbeat, defiant as sunrise. The priests could not name it, could not punish it, for it was not declaration, it was breath. But it was breath they could not control. When the procession ended, the people dispersed quietly. No riot, no uprising, no bloodshed, only silence. Only a song too quiet to silence. The priests declared victory, but their eyes betrayed fear, for they had felt it too, that hollow ringing of authority ignored. The young man walked home with the book pressed close. He whispered to himself, "Silence is stronger than fire." And he knew that night would be remembered, not as the triumph of fear, but as the moment the hidden choir revealed its strength without a word. The book had always lived on the edge of disappearance. Fire hunted it, guards seized it, priests condemned it. Yet somehow it endured, not because of chance, not because of miracles alone, but because of hands, quiet, steady hands, that refused to let the words die. These hands belonged to the shadow scribes. The young man first heard whispers of them from the baker, who once slipped him a folded scrap with only 2 words written, "Keep copying." At first, he thought it meant nothing. But later, as he studied the fragile ink, he realized it was instruction. The scribes were everywhere, hidden in plain sight, copying the book 1 line at a time, 1 margin note at a time, scattering fragments like seeds. Their work was dangerous. To be caught with ink-stained fingers was to invite interrogation, exile, sometimes death. Yet they wrote anyway, by candlelight in barns, by moonlight in kitchens, with makeshift quills carved from feathers, with ink brewed from soot and vinegar. They wrote on parchment when they had it, on scraps of cloth when they didn't, sometimes even on the walls of cellars, knowing the words might one day be discovered by another soul who needed them. The book itself spoke of such hands. Truth survives not by monuments, but by memory, not by towers, but by scribes. The shadow scribes had taken that to heart. They never waited for permission. They never asked for safety. They wrote because silence was worse than death. The young man longed to join them, though he feared his skill was not enough. His letters were uneven, his ink often blotched. But one evening, the baker pressed a quill into his hand and said, "Write anyway." And so he began. At first, clumsy lines scratched across parchment. But slowly, as nights passed, his hand steadied. He copied the words, not for beauty, but for survival. Each letter carried weight. Each phrase became a lifeline. He realized quickly that copying was more than preservation. It was transformation. Writing the words forced him to live them. Each stroke carved the truth deeper into his own soul. He remembered one passage in particular. Error is the crack where light enters. He had read it many times, but when he copied it letter by letter, he felt it differently. The letters sank into him, each one a reminder of his own cracks, his own repairs. Copying made the book his own. The shadow scribes had their own codes. They disguised texts as household lists, burying wisdom between recipes. They inserted forbidden lines into hymns, altering one word so subtly only the awakened noticed. They stitched single letters into clothing, forming phrases when the garments were laid side by side. Some even carved tiny inscriptions into the handles of tools, where fingers would trace them daily without ever knowing why they felt stronger holding them. In his copy, the young man found margin notes written in hands not much older than children. One read, "I write by night while they sleep. They will not silence me." Another, shakier, seemed written by someone nearing death. "I leave these words for you. Carry them further than I could." The book was not only text, it was testimony. The scribes themselves lived within its margins. shadows refusing to fade. The authorities raged against them. Edicts declared that anyone found copying would lose their hands. Some did, but others wrote with stumps, with mouths, with whatever remained, for the scribes understood that truth did not need perfect hands, only faithful ones. The young man copied until his fingers ached. Some nights he feared discovery, his heart pounding at every creak of the floorboards. Yet beneath the fear he felt alive. He knew he was part of something greater, a chain of shadow scribes stretching across centuries, each one preserving what the fire could not destroy. He whispered to himself as he worked, "I am a scribe now. I am shadow. I am seed." And though the world would never know his name, he knew the words he copied would outlive him. That was enough. That was everything. The night was cold and the sky was dark with heavy clouds. The young man sat by his small fire, the book open on his lap, the secret map folded beside it. He knew danger pressed closer now than ever before. Rumours swirled that the priests were preparing a sweep of the villages, determined to root out the last fragments of the forbidden text. Fear hung thick in the air. But as he stared into the fire, he saw something else, an ember, glowing faintly at the edge of the ash. It pulsed weakly, almost gone, yet still alive. He leaned closer, shielding it with his hand, coaxing it with breath. Slowly, the ember flared, faint but steady, and in its glow he saw the book's truth embodied. The book had always taught this, that truth is ember, not blaze. Flames rise and fall, consuming themselves in bursts of glory. But embers endure. Embers wait. Embers carry heat across nights, across winters, across centuries. The young man realized then that he did not need to see fire consume towers or armies. He only needed to protect the ember. He closed the book and placed his hand over it. He whispered words not written in any margin but rising from his own soul. As long as one ember lives, the fire will return. As long as one ember glows, the truth endures. He felt the vow sink into him, deeper than fear, deeper than doubt. In that moment, he thought of all who had come before. The seamstress stitching words into hems, the child skipping forbidden rhythms, the baker slipping fragments into bread, the shadow scribes bleeding ink onto scraps of parchment. Each had carried their ember, small and fragile, yet enough. Each had passed it on, and now it was his turn. The last ember did not belong to him alone. It belonged to all who had whispered, written, sung, or wept for the book. It belonged to the hidden choir, to the networks of silence, to every reader who had spoken the oath in trembling voice. He was not alone. The ember was never alone. He scooped the glowing coal into a clay dish and covered it gently, knowing it would keep its heat until morning. He imagined others doing the same across the land, keeping embers alive in secret hearths, waiting for the day when fire could burn openly again. And he smiled, not in triumph, but in quiet certainty. The book had taught him many things, but this was its final gift. Truth does not need to roar, it only needs to glow. And glow it will, in hearts, in whispers, in lives that choose love over fear. He lay down to sleep with the ember flickering beside him, his breath steady, his heart at peace. He knew the priests might come, he knew the danger might never end, but he also knew the ember would outlast them all. For fire dies, embers endure, and embers, given time, always ignite again. The dangerous book had never existed in only one form. It was copied, scattered, torn, hidden. Fragments carried its heart just as fully as whole volumes. The young man learned this truth one evening when he was summoned, quietly, to the edge of the forest by a woman known only as the Keeper. She was older than most in the village, her back bent, her hair silver, her eyes bright with the kind of knowing that comes from decades of silence. She lived alone, in a cabin weathered by storms, its walls lined with jars of herbs and bundles of dried roots. The villagers thought of her as a healer, a midwife, someone useful but strange. Few guessed her deeper role. When the young man entered her cabin, the air smelled of smoke and lavender. She motioned him to sit. Without words, she placed a small wooden box on the table. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay scraps, tiny pieces of parchment, brittle with age, some no larger than a fingernail. Each bore only a few words, sometimes only a letter. At first, he wondered how such fragments could matter, but as she spread them across the table, arranging them carefully, he saw lines emerge. Not full passages, but echoes. Do not kill love. Error, light enters. Seeds, endure. The words pulsed with life, incomplete yet unmistakable. He felt as though he were watching bones reassemble themselves into something whole. The keeper spoke finally, her voice low. These are what remained from burnings, from searches, from lives lost. I gathered them, I could not throw them away, and I found even the smallest fragment carries fire. She told him stories of how she had collected them. A scrap hidden in the hem of a cloak given to her by a dying traveller. Another found in the ashes of a fire pit, half burned but still legible. Another slipped under her door by hands she never saw. Each fragment was a survivor, bearing the scars of flame, the marks of time. Yet together they sang. The young man bent close, reading the fragments again and again. He realized that the fragments mattered not only for what they said, but for what they symbolized. They were proof that the book could never be erased. Even torn apart, its truth remained alive. Even scattered, it whispered. Even broken, it healed. The keeper placed one fragment in his palm. It read only, "Eyes open." She closed his fingers around it. "Carry this," she said. "When you doubt, remember, even a fragment can guide you." He tucked it into his cloak, close to his heart. For weeks afterward, whenever fear pressed heavy, he would touch the scrap and whisper the words, "Eyes open." It was enough to steady him. The book itself had spoken of fragments. You do not need the whole to live the truth. A spark is enough to light the dark. A seed is enough to grow the field. The young man finally understood. He no longer mourned what was lost. He celebrated what remained. For fragments multiplied. Fragments scattered wider than any guarded volume ever could. The keeper smiled faintly as he left her cabin. "Remember," she said, "they fear fragments most of all, because fragments prove survival. Fragments prove they failed." And as he walked into the night, the young man carried not just words, but certainty. The dangerous book was not fragile. It was indestructible, because even in pieces, it was whole. Winter had settled deep across the land, nights stretching long and cold, days short and grey. Fear often grew strongest in such seasons, when people felt small and weary. The priests knew this, and they pressed harder, warning of darkness, demanding rituals. Insisting obedience was the only way through. But the young man began to notice something else in those winter nights. Lanterns. Not the large, official ones hung in cathedrals, but small ones carried quietly, flickering against the snow. At first, he thought them ordinary. Yet the more he looked, the more he saw a pattern. The lanterns marked paths. They lit doorways. They gathered people in barns and cellars. They guided the hidden choir. The lantern carriers were not leaders, not scribes, not priests. They were ordinary people who chose to keep light visible when fear pressed heavy. Their task was simple: carry fire, pass it on, make sure no one walked in total dark. But simple did not mean small, for without them, the fragments would stay hidden, the whispers would fade, the ember would die. One night, the young man followed a faint trail of lanterns beyond the edge of the village. Each one hung low, swaying gently, spaced far apart. At last he reached a barn, its doors slightly ajar. Inside, a circle of neighbours sat, lanterns placed at their feet, the book's lines spoken softly from memory. No volume lay open, no parchment passed. Yet the words flowed, each person carrying a piece, each voice contributing. It was not performance, it was survival. He realized then that the lanterns were more than light. They were signals, saying, "Here is safety, here is truth, here is belonging." Those who carried them risked exposure, yet they did it anyway, because without visible signs, people lost hope. Without light, fear claimed the night. The book had written, "Be lanterns, not towers. Towers fall, lanterns move." The carriers lived this. They did not try to build great monuments. They simply lit what was near, step by step, night by night, and that was enough to keep the path alive. The young man was given his own lantern. Its frame was bent, its glass cracked, its flame small. Yet when he carried it home, he felt as though he held the world's fire. He placed it in his window, the light faint but steady. Some nights no one noticed. Other nights he saw shadows pause at his door, just long enough to whisper thanks into the dark. The lantern became his silent vow. "I will not let the light die." The priests could never outlaw lanterns. They could forbid words, burn books, silence songs, but they could not erase light from windows. They could not accuse someone of carrying fire for warmth. They could not stop the small, ordinary act of placing a lantern where others could see. The young man realized this was the genius of the dangerous book. It had never been about grand revolutions. It had been about small lights multiplying until darkness could no longer hold. And as he watched his lantern flicker against the snow one night, he whispered, "The book lives, we live." The night had been long. Longer than most. Rumours of raids kept people awake. Fires had burned in the distance. Soldiers marched on the roads. The young man sat by his lantern, the book pressed against his chest, his heart beating fast. Fear pressed heavy, but alongside it came a quiet sense that something was shifting. At last, the sky began to pale. Not bright yet, not golden, but lighter than black. The first hint of dawn. He stepped outside into the chill. All across the village, he saw lanterns still burning in windows, their faint flames holding on until the sun returned. He realized then what the book had always promised. Night is never final. Dawn always comes. The dangerous book spoke of thresholds. Between dark and light lies choice. At the threshold, you decide who you are. This was such a threshold, not just for him, but for all who carried fragments, who hummed forbidden lines, who wrote in margins, who whispered in kitchens. Each had held the ember through the long night. Now the horizon glowed with the promise that their watch had not been in vain. The priests would rage, the soldiers would still patrol, but the dawn was stronger, for dawn revealed that fear could not last forever. Fear thrived in darkness, but light exposed its emptiness. The young man raised his lantern one last time. Its flame flickered, then died, swallowed by the greater light of morning. He smiled. The lantern had done its work. It had carried him and others through the night. Now the sun carried the rest. He looked at the book in his hands. He no longer feared it would vanish. He no longer mourned what was lost. For he understood the book was not bound to parchment or ink. It was alive in the lanterns, in the whispers, in the fragments, in the silence, in the choices people made at the threshold of dawn. He whispered softly, "We are the book now." And as the sun rose higher, spilling gold across rooftops and fields, he felt it in his bones. The dangerous book had not been suppressed. It had been planted. And now, as dawn broke, it was rising everywhere. The village square was never truly silent. Even on cold mornings when frost painted the stones, children's laughter echoed between the walls. They chased each other with sticks. They played at soldiers. They drew shapes in the dirt. The young man often watched them with a mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy, because children carried freedom in their bones. Sorrow, because he knew the church's grip reached for them too, pressing fear into their games, bending imagination into obedience. But then he noticed something else. Some of the children's games carried traces of the dangerous book. A rhyme here, a phrase there. At first, he thought it coincidence. Yet, as he listened closer, he realized they were repeating lines that could not have come from sermons. One girl skipped a rope, chanting, "Seeds endure, seeds endure." Another scratched into the dirt the shape of an open eye, then stomped it out before a passerby could see. The book had always said, "Teach the children with laughter, for laughter survives when fear forgets." And here it was, alive before his eyes. The children had become keepers without knowing it. They carried fragments in rhymes, wove wisdom into play, scattered truth in their laughter. One evening, as he passed by the baker's, he overheard two boys whispering. They crouched beside the wall, carving letters with a shard of stone. The letters spelled, "Love over fear." The young man's heart clenched. These were not scribes trained in secrecy. They were children, yet already part of the hidden choir. He remembered how the priests targeted the young, teaching fear early, stamping obedience before curiosity could grow. But he realized now that the book's power was stronger. It seeped even into games, into songs, into the secret worlds of children. And once truth rooted in them, it could not be uprooted. In his own copy, a margin note had been written in uneven letters, the handwriting of a child. "I copied this so my mother would smile." Another said, "I am not afraid, I am awake." These small voices carried as much weight as the proclamations of kings. For children did not guard truth, they lived it. The young man began to teach them quietly. He never lectured, never declared. He simply joined their games, shifting rhymes slightly, adding words the book had taught him. Soon, the children repeated them as though they had always been there. They learned without knowing they were learning. They carried the dangerous book forward without ever touching its pages. He realized then that the children were not merely the next generation of readers. They were the book itself, reborn in laughter and play. And no authority could confiscate that. Winter thawed slowly into spring. Travellers returned to the roads, their cloaks dusty, their eyes weary from long journeys. One evening, a pilgrim arrived in the village, leaning on a staff, carrying little more than a bundle. His face was lined, his voice hoarse, his steps heavy. The people greeted him with suspicion, for strangers often brought danger. But the young man felt something in the pilgrim's eyes, something familiar. He offered the pilgrim food and a place by his fire. They spoke little at first, but as night deepened, the pilgrim leaned close and whispered, "Do you carry the book?" The young man froze. His hand instinctively pressed against his cloak, where his copy rested. "Yes," he whispered back. The pilgrim's eyes softened. From his bundle, he withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it carefully on the table and unfolded it. Inside lay a tiny book, barely larger than a palm, its pages thin, its ink faded. "This," the pilgrim said, "is the gift I carry. It has travelled across mountains, hidden in bread, sewn into clothes, buried in soil. It has survived storms and raids. It is not whole, but it breathes still." The young man touched the fragile pages with reverence. The lines were familiar, yet slightly altered, shaped by different hands, different times. Margins filled with notes in languages he barely recognized. The pilgrim explained, "Everywhere it goes, it changes. Every reader leaves their mark. That is its power. It is never the same book twice." They read together by firelight, trading lines, marvelling at the echoes and differences. Some passages were new to the young man, yet they carried the same spirit. Love over fear, freedom over chains, truth over silence. He realized then that the book was not one text but many, a river with countless streams feeding into it. The pilgrim smiled faintly. I cannot carry it further. My journey ends here, but yours continues. Take it. The young man resisted. It is yours. The pilgrim shook his head. It was never mine, it was always ours. And so the young man received the gift, a second copy, fragile and sacred. He placed it beside his own, marvelling at how the two together sang in harmony, like two voices in the hidden choir. The pilgrim left at dawn, his staff tapping against the stones, his figure fading into the horizon. The young man watched him go, clutching the gift close. He knew he carried not just words, but generations of survival. And with that weight came strength. As spring deepened, the young man began to sense something stirring across the land. Whispers travelled faster, lanterns glowed brighter, fragments multiplied. He realized the book was not scattered randomly. It was weaving itself together, not into a single volume, but into a living tapestry across lives, voices, choices. One evening, he dreamt of a vast loom stretching across the sky. Threads of light descended, each one carrying a fragment of the book. Some threads glowed brightly, others faint, some frayed, some strong. Yet as they interwove, they formed patterns more beautiful than any single thread could hold. He woke trembling, certain the dream was more than dream. It was vision. The book had spoken of this. Truth is not one voice, but many woven. Do not seek the single strand, seek the fabric it forms. He understood now. The dangerous book was not about preserving one perfect copy. It was about weaving lives together into a whole that no fire could consume. In the village, he saw this weaving daily. The children's rhymes, the baker's whispered phrases, the seamstress's stitched hems, the lanterns in windows, the pilgrim's gift, each was a thread, alone, fragile, together, unbreakable. He began to speak of weaving when he gathered secretly with others. He told them, "You are the book, we are the fabric. Each of us carries a thread, and together we form what cannot be torn." Their eyes lit with recognition. They understood. They had felt it already, though unnamed. The priests still raged, still hunted, still burned. But the young man no longer feared them. For how could they burn a tapestry spread across countless souls? How could they silence a weaving already larger than their towers? The dangerous book was no longer hidden. It was alive in fragments, in lanterns, in oaths, in laughter, in silence, in courage. It had become the great weaving of humanity itself. And as the young man traced the threads he carried, he whispered, "We are not alone. We are woven." The priests often spoke of pilgrimages, journeys to holy shrines, walks of penance, long roads of obedience. But the young man came to understand there was another pilgrimage, one not marked by bells or banners, but by silence, whispers, and hidden steps. It was the secret pilgrimage of the book. He had seen glimpses of it before, travellers who carried fragments, pilgrims who offered gifts, lanterns marking paths in the night. But now, stories began to reach him of entire journeys shaped around the dangerous book. People leaving their homes not to kneel at altars, but to carry fragments further, to plant seeds in new soil, to awaken voices in distant places. One evening, a traveller arrived at his door. She was young, her hair tangled from long roads, her shoes torn. She carried no visible burden. But when she sat by the fire, she drew from her pocket a pebble, smoothed and marked with a single letter, carved deep into its surface. "I carry this from the north," she whispered. "It is one of many. Each pilgrim carries one letter. Together they spell what the priests forbid." The young man stared at the pebble with awe. The woman explained, "We meet on the road, we exchange letters, we pass them along. No one person carries the whole, but together we rebuild the words. The priests cannot stop it." They cannot burn what they cannot find. This was the secret pilgrimage countless travellers, walking roads that seemed ordinary, yet carrying the living book in fragments, in symbols, in breath. Their journeys were not marked by stone shrines, but by meeting eyes, by whispered oaths, by small acts of courage shared at crossroads. The book itself spoke of such journeys. Walk not to altars of stone, but to the altars of each other's hearts. The holy path is the road between awakened souls. The young man realized that this was already happening. The world itself had become the shrine. The journey itself was the worship. The woman stayed only one night. In the morning, she left her pebble in his hand. "Carry it further," she said. "Every step you take with it is prayer." When she was gone, he held the pebble close, its carved letter pressing into his palm. He felt its weight, small yet eternal, and he whispered to himself, "The pilgrimage has begun." Summer came, heavy with heat and dust. The air carried the scent of fields ripening, but also the weight of watchful eyes. Soldiers patrolled more often. Priests thundered more fiercely. Fear pressed hard. Yet beneath the surface, the young man sensed something rising. One night, he was invited in secret to follow a path out of the village. Lanterns marked the way, faint flickers hidden among trees. At last, he reached a clearing where dozens of people gathered. Old and young, women and men, farmers, bakers, weavers, all stood in a circle. None carried books, none held parchments. Yet when the night grew still, a single voice began to sing. It was not hymn approved by priests. It was not chant bound to ritual. It was a line from the dangerous book, stretched into melody. Love over fear. Another voice joined, then another. Soon the circle swelled with song, not loud, not polished, but alive. Each voice wove with the next, forming harmonies that trembled through the trees. The young man felt tears burn his eyes. This was the hidden choir he had once sensed in whispers and glances. Here it was, alive, gathered, singing freely. Every note was rebellion. Every harmony was defiance. For in that song, fear had no place. The book had spoken of this. When voices join, fear cracks. No tower can stand against a choir. And he saw it now. The forbidden choir was more dangerous than any sword, more uncontainable than any fire, because once voices sing, silence can never reclaim them. The priests would call it heresy. The soldiers would call it crime. But to those who sang, it was freedom, and freedom, once tasted, is never forgotten. The young man joined his voice to theirs. His throat trembled, his voice cracked, but he sang anyway. He sang until the stars seemed to tremble above them, and in that night he understood. The book was not only read, it was sung, and in song it could never die. Autumn returned, the air sharp with change, the leaves falling like pages torn from time. The young man began to notice a pattern. At the edge of fields, at the borders of roads, at the tops of hills people lingered, not working, not travelling, just watching. They were the watchers of the horizon. At first he thought them idle, but one evening, as he passed a hill where a shepherd stood gazing west, he paused to ask why. The shepherd turned, eyes clear, and whispered, "We watch for signs, we watch for travellers, we watch for the dawn." The young man realized then that the watchers were guardians of hope. They stood where the sky met the earth, keeping vigil for what was coming. They looked not for soldiers or priests, but for the rising of something greater, the moment when the dangerous book, long hidden, would no longer need to hide. The book had spoken of such watchers. Stand at the edge of tomorrow. Keep your eyes on the horizon, for their dawn will rise. The words echoed in him now. He knew the watchers were not waiting for miracles. They were waiting for courage to grow strong enough, for love to gather loud enough, for fear to crumble at last. He joined them sometimes, standing silent on ridges, his eyes fixed on the far line where sky touched earth. He saw nothing, only distance, only clouds, only fading Sunday. Yet he felt everything: anticipation, belonging, purpose. To watch was to declare, "I believe dawn will come." One evening, as he stood among them, the horizon flared with light, not sunrise, not sunset, but something different. A fire in the distance, not of destruction, but of lanterns multiplied, scattered across the land. The watchers smiled, their faces glowing. "It has begun," one whispered. And the young man knew. The horizon no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to love, to whispers, to fragments, to lanterns, to choirs, to every reader who had ever spoken the oath. The dawn was not far. The horizon was already rising. The young man had long suspected that the fragments, the lanterns, the songs, and the whispers were not separate threads, but parts of something larger. That suspicion grew when one autumn evening he was led blindfolded through the forest by two figures he barely recognized. They said nothing, only guided him along uneven paths until the sound of water reached his ears. When the blindfold was removed, he found himself at the mouth of a cave lit by candles flickering against stone. Inside, a circle of people sat in silence. Some faces he knew: the baker, the seamstress, the old keeper of fragments. Others were strangers, travellers with the dust of distant roads still clinging to their cloaks. Each held a candle, its flame trembling, yet steady. At the centre of the circle lay no book, no parchment, nothing visible to betray them, only silence. Then, one by one, they began to speak, not with names, but with stories. A shepherd told of hiding words in songs, so his flock would remember them. A child whispered of scratching cymbals into dirt at the edge of fields. A traveller spoke of carrying pebbles carved with letters across mountains. Each voice carried fragments, and as they wove together, the silence turned into a living book. The young man listened with awe. He realized this was the hidden council, the gathering of those who carried the dangerous book, not as possession, but as breath. They were not leaders, not rulers, not even united by plan. They were simply guardians, each carrying a piece, each ensuring survival. When it was his turn to speak, his voice trembled. He told of his copy, of the map hidden in its binding, of the lantern in his window, of the ember he kept alive through winter nights. He spoke of fear and of love, stronger than fear. When he finished, the circle did not applaud, but each candle seemed to glow brighter. The council had received his voice. He was part of the weaving now. At the end, the keeper lifted her candle and whispered the oath. "I will not close my eyes once opened." One by one, every voice repeated it. The sound filled the cave, echoing off stone until it felt like the walls themselves swore the oath. The young man whispered it too, and felt it settle into his bones like fire. The council ended as quietly as it began. No declarations, no commands, only the knowledge that they were not alone. The blindfold was replaced, the forest retraced, and when he returned to his home, he carried no parchment, no orders, yet he carried more strength than ever before. For he knew now that across the land, countless others kept vigil, countless others whispered truth, countless others carried fragments of the book. The dangerous book was no longer in danger. It lived in the council, unseen, unstoppable, eternal. The autumn deepened, and the nights grew longer. Fear tightened again, as priests demanded stricter rituals and soldiers patrolled heavier. But something stirred in the air, something even fear could not hold back. It began with one lantern in a window, then another, then another. Soon the village glowed with lights scattered like stars fallen to earth. At first, the young man thought it was only his own people. But as he climbed the ridge beyond the fields, he saw it was everywhere. Lanterns dotted the horizon, not just in one village, but in every settlement as far as his eyes could see. 10, 100, 1,000 points of light. They flickered across hills and valleys, across roads and rivers, until the land itself seemed to breathe with fire. This was not planned by any council. It was not decreed, not commanded. It happened because the time had come. Each family, each soul, each hidden reader chose to place their light in defiance. Together, unknowingly, they created a constellation across the earth. The priests panicked. They declared it rebellion. They sent soldiers to snuff out the lanterns. But for every light extinguished, 3 more appeared. Windows that had been dark for years now glowed. Doors once barred now opened. The night belonged not to fear, but to the people. The young man lit his lantern and placed it in his window, then carried another to the ridge. Standing there, he watched the horizon burn with stars of flame. His heart swelled with a joy so deep it brought tears. He whispered to himself, "This is the book, this is its fire." The book had promised this. 1 flame alone is fragile, 10,000 together are eternal. And here it was, fulfilled before his eyes. The night of 10,000 lanterns, the night fear lost its crown. He stood until dawn, watching as the lanterns faded into the light of morning, and he knew no decree could ever undo what had been seen. The people had remembered their strength. The dangerous book had become a sky of fire. Morning broke clear and cold, the air crisp with change. People emerged from their homes, bleary-eyed but unafraid. They had seen the lanterns. They had stood in their glow. The priests tried to declare it meaningless. The soldiers tried to call it disobedience, but the people did not listen. They carried the memory of the night in their bones. The young man gathered with others in the square, not because they were ordered, but because they chose to. They carried no banners, no weapons, only their voices. As the sun rose, someone began to speak the oath. Quiet at first. "I will not close my eyes," once opened. Another voice joined, then another. Soon the square trembled with the sound of hundreds repeating it, their voices rising with the Sunday. It was not rebellion, it was awakening. The oath was not against the priests, it was for each other. For truth, for love over fear, for dawn itself. The young man spoke it with tears streaming down his face. He remembered the fragment the keeper had given him, eyes open. Now the whole village carried it. Now the land itself carried it. The oath had become the heartbeat of the people. The priests fled the square. The soldiers lowered their weapons. No one fought, no one burned, no one bled. Only words, spoken in unison, stronger than steel. The book had always said, "The true weapon is awakening." And now he saw it. The people had awakened. The young man felt the sun on his face and whispered one final time, "I will not close my eyes once opened." He knew he had crossed the threshold. Fear had lost its throne. The dangerous book had become life itself. The cathedral bells had always ruled the rhythm of life. They rang to summon, to warn, to command. They marked obedience in iron tones that echoed across valleys and villages. For years, people moved when they told, knelt when they rang, bowed when they thundered. The sound was authority made flesh. But the young man began to notice that the bells no longer carried the same weight. It happened slowly. One morning, the bells rang for worship, and fewer people came. Another day, they rang for obedience, and workers lingered in the fields. The sound was the same, but the hearts that once trembled now stood steady. The night of lanterns, the dawn oath these had shifted the air. The bells could no longer dictate the soul. Then came the day of fracture. The priests rang the bells louder than ever, trying to drown the whispers of the people. The air shook, the towers quivered, but in the square below, silence answered. Not fearful silence this time, but defiant silence, full of memory, full of choice. The sound clashed against their stillness until, with a great crack, one bell split. Its tone broke into chaos, no longer command, but noise. The people gasped, then laughed. A sound once feared was now powerless. The book had spoken of this. When fear loses its echo, chains fall from the sound. And so it was. The bells had lost their crown. The young man stood in the square, his lantern still in his hand. He realized that fear's tools often shatter, not by force, but by neglect. Authority demands belief to survive, and when belief is withdrawn, even iron bells crack. From that day forward, the bells no longer ruled. They rang, but no one moved. They tolled, but no one bowed. They had become hollow reminders of a power already fading, and the dangerous book whispered in every heart, "No sound commands the free." Change did not come like thunder. It came like tide, slow at first, steady, then unstoppable. The young man saw it in small things. Neighbours, once silent, now spoke openly of fragments. Farmers painted symbols of eyes on their barns. Children sang the forbidden rhymes loudly, no longer in whispers. Lanterns remained in windows even in daylight, as if to say, "The night cannot return." The priests tried to resist. They shouted louder, condemned fiercer, punished harsher. But every act of fear only fed the tide, for people had seen too much to return. The night of 10,000 lanterns had burned into their bones. The dawn oath had sealed their eyes open. The young man remembered a passage. The tide of love rises without armies. It drowns fear not with weapons, but with patience. He saw it now, embodied in every face that refused to bow. This was the rising tide. It was not war. It was awakening. Travellers brought news from afar. Entire villages where priests no longer held sway. Towns where the dangerous book was read aloud in gatherings, not hidden but celebrated. Songs that carried across rivers, telling of freedom. The tide was not local. It was everywhere. One evening, standing on the ridge, the young man looked out and saw lanterns still burning, but now accompanied by bonfires. People gathered openly, no longer hiding their light. He felt awe wash over him. This was no longer survival. This was rebirth. He whispered the words of the book. Fear is tower. Love is ocean. Towers sink. Oceans rise. The rising tide had come. The young man sat by his fire, the book resting in his hands. He thought of the journey of fragments hidden in hems, of scribes writing in shadows, of lanterns glowing against snow, of choirs singing beneath trees, of watchers on horizons. He thought of ashes turned to seeds, of embers carried across winters, of children carrying truth in laughter. He thought of every life that had touched the book, and every life the book had touched, and he realized the truth. The dangerous book was no longer a book. It was no longer fragile parchment, no longer ink that could be burned, no longer pages that could be torn. It had become people. It had become memory. It had become breath. He whispered softly, "We are the book now." The priests could no longer suppress it, because it was not bound. It flowed in songs, in silence, in choices. It lived in the rising tide, in the lanterns, in the oath. It lived in every soul that chose love over fear. The book itself had foretold this. I am not paper. I am seed. I am not ink. I am fire. You are my pages. You are my voice. When you live, I endure. The young man closed his eyes and felt peace wash over him. He no longer feared the day soldiers might come or priests might rage. For the book was eternal now, written into the very fabric of humanity. No fire could erase it, no bell could silence it, no fear could chain it. He placed the book gently on the table, its cover worn, its pages fragile. It no longer needed to be hidden. Its work was done. Outside, the horizon glowed with the first light of morning. And in that light, the dangerous book lived on, eternal, unstoppable, free. The book had always been heavy in the young man's hands, not from its size, but from its weight of memory. Yet one evening, as he leafed through the fragile parchment, he found something strange. Near the back, where the binding frayed and the ink faded, entire pages lay blank. He thought at first they were lost to time, perhaps scraped clean by hands desperate for parchment. But when he looked closer, he saw faint indentations, like words once written and then erased, as though they waited to be filled again. He touched the blank pages gently, tracing them with his fingertips. They felt alive, humming with possibility. And in that moment he understood. These pages were not missing. They were meant for him. The book was unfinished, waiting for each reader to continue it. That night, he sat by his fire with a quill in hand. Fear trembled in him. How could he add to a book carried through centuries, guarded by martyrs, whispered by choirs? But the book itself had said, "Do not worship words, become them." And so he dipped his quill into ink and began to write. He did not try to copy the old lines. He wrote his own. Simple truths from his own life, the lantern he had lit, the ember he had carried, the fragment that read, "Eyes open," the oath spoken in the square. He wrote them not as grand proclamations, but as memories, lived and felt. As he wrote, he realized every reader must have faced the same invitation. The fragments he had seen scattered across the land were not accidents. They were unwritten pages filled by countless hands. The dangerous book had never been complete, because completion would have killed it. Its strength lay in being endless, carried forward, written anew. By dawn his hand ached and his eyes burned, but his heart felt light. The blank pages were no longer blank. They carried his story. And he knew one day someone else would add theirs. The book had become not just history, but horizon. And its horizon stretched without end. The tide had risen, the oath had been spoken, the bells had shattered. But the young man knew the work was not finished. Awakening was not a single moment, it was a fire that needed tending, passed carefully, kept alive. Across the land, people became carriers of that fire. He saw it in the way neighbours shared fragments with travellers, slipping them into bags of grain. He saw it in songs carried across rivers by boatmen, their melodies soft but steady. He saw it in letters exchanged between villages, coded phrases hiding truth in plain sight. The fire was no longer a secret. It was a current flowing everywhere, carried by ordinary lives. The book had warned, fire forgotten dies, fire carried endures, and now everyone seemed to understand. They became fire carriers, each holding a spark, each ensuring the next would not be left in darkness. One evening, the young man met a woman who carried no copy, no fragment, no lantern. Yet when she spoke, every word glowed with the spirit of the book. She had become a carrier without parchment, without ink. She was fire itself. He realized then that carrying fire did not mean guarding texts or symbols. It meant living the truth so clearly that others felt its warmth. The priests still clung to their towers, still tried to shout down the tide. But their words grew cold. Their rituals felt empty. The fire of the people burned warmer. And warmth is always stronger than cold. The young man whispered one line as he walked home that night. "I am fire, and I carry fire." He knew it was true, and he knew countless others whispered it too. The fire could never be suppressed now. It lived in too many hearts.